Hello, my name is Rafael Grohmann. I'm an assistant professor in communication at the Unisinos University and coordinator of DigiLabor Research Lab. I would like to welcome you to the second webinar of our seminar entitled Automation and Digitalization in Contemporary Capitalism. The seminar is jointly organized by three research groups in different Brazilian universities, namely the research group in the political economy of development at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Norte, the research group in economy, society, and technology, NETS, at the Federal University of Ceará, and the DigiLabor Research Lab at the Unisinos University. And today, our guest speaker is Paul Cockshott, who kindly accept our invitation to present and discuss on the complexity order of economic planning. He is a computer scientist, economist, and a reader and leading researcher and reader at the University of Glasgow and leading researcher on things about economic planning, Marxism, and algorithms. And he wrote the following books: Towards a New Socialism, Arguments for Socialism, Computation and Its Limits, and his new book, How the World Works, the story of human labor from prehistory to the modern day. So we will start with Paul Cockshott's presentation, and afterwards we will have a Q&A session. So welcome, Paul Cockshott. Thank you very much for having us today, and the floor is totally yours.
Thank you. I must apologize that there's no picture of me. The camera isn't working, but we do have my lecture material. I'm going to first give you a bit of the historical background of the debate, and then I'll look at some experimental research work that I've done over the last 3 years into this topic. The basic issue is whether an economy should have calculation in kind or in money. In the period just after the First World War, the left-wing Austrian economist Neurath advocated that socialist economy had to learn from war economy. He said that in war economy, you have to do calculations in kind, that to survive, states had to prioritize physical production of key raw materials, labor, foodstuffs, etc. And he proposed this as the model for socialist planning. Now, given the political circumstances in Austria at the time, the immediate aftermath of the Russian Revolution, a very strong social democratic or socialist movement in Austria, this was seen as a big threat in Vienna at the time. So you have other Austrian school economists coming out against him. The most best known in this were von Mises and Hayek, and the first off the mark was von Mises. And he argued that only money provided a rational basis for comparing costs, because essentially his argument is you have to see which is the most economically efficient way of doing something. Unless you've got money, you can't compare two different types of cost in different units of production, different means of production. And he rejected calculation in terms of labor time because he said millions of equations would have to be solved. Hayek went on to argue that the market is like a telephone exchange system, and it exchanges the information necessary to tie up the economy, and that only the market can solve the problem of dispersed information. At this time, we're talking about the 20s and 30s, mathematicians started to work on it. The first guy off the mark was Robert Remak, a German mathematician who came up with a proposal to set, this was at the height of the Great Recession, he came up with a proposal to operate the German economy at prices which are roughly equivalent to Marx's labor values. And he showed that you could do the calculations for this, he said, using electromechanical calculation. Von Neumann came up with an alternative thing because he didn't agree with the approach of using labor values. He was not a socialist, but his model of economic growth and economic planning really only makes sense in the context of a planned economy. Because of it, he has this uniform growth path, which again has to be seen in the light of the early Soviet planning which was going on at the time. Von Neumann was using linear algebra to do this. It comes just after he's written the Foundations of Quantum Mechanics, which again uses linear algebra techniques, and he takes the quantum mechanic techniques to the economy. And the most general solution came from Leonid Kantorovich, working in the Soviet Union, who came up with what later came to be known as linear programming. Now let's look at the scale of the problem of doing this. In the mid-1950s, Gosplan in Russia could prepare detailed material balances, that is to say, the kinds of calculations that Neurath was talking about, for some 3,000 products. But by the late 60s, there were several million distinct products in the Soviet economy. And the actual staff of Gosplan was quite small. People think of the Soviet Union as having a vast bureaucracy, but it had only 3,000 or 4,000 civil servants working in Gosplan. So they couldn't handle more than that. Now let's think of it as a computational task. Suppose you've got 1 million products, and each product uses, let's say on average, 200 other components in its manufacture. You can define any production process then as a list of pairs, saying the product code of the input followed by the amount of the input you're going to need to produce 1 unit of output. And if each of those take 2 full words of computer memory, you would need, say, 400 million words of memory to do it, or say 1.5 gigabytes of memory. That doesn't sound much to us now. Ideally, you'd have wanted 1.5 gigabytes of fast RAM. At a pinch, you could have done it with hard disks. By the late 70s, America had CDC drives up to 300 megabytes. Now, we're used to thinking of drives now in hundreds of gigabytes, but these were hundreds of megabytes were the best that could be done. But there were embargoes on export of this kind of equipment to the USSR. In addition, you would have needed at least 1 million words of fast RAM. And the best US technology didn't reach this level until 1975. And those would certainly not have been exportable, the craze of the time. There were explicit bans on the export of that equipment. But all of this can be easily done on modern computers. Even laptops have enough memory. In what follows, I'm going to present experiments, look at how complex the calculations are. And I've actually released the software on GitHub, which gives a pair of packages for preparing n-year plans. One of them uses Kantorovich's approach. The other uses the harmony method that we advocated in Towards a New Socialism. On SourceForge, those were released about perhaps 2 years ago. SourceForge, at the end of last year, I released a third package that was written in the new programming language, Julia, and uses Leontief's planning techniques. So let's look at Kantorovich style planning. If you're going to use it, it's a Java program. You say Java planning n-year plan after you've installed the stuff, and then give it a set of spreadsheets. And the spreadsheets, to make them easy to edit and read, are all in comma separated value form. And then it produces as output the plan. Now let's look at the spreadsheets you need, because one needs to decide on a standard way of feeding the information in. And I took spreadsheets both because they're easy to edit and work with, but also because your starting point, suppose you want to do some prospective macroeconomic plans for Brazil, your starting point is going to be the Brazilian IO tables, and those are published in spreadsheet forms. So people working in any country can at least start off with spreadsheet form tables. And if you don't know how to read a spreadsheet, then Leontief format, they're column-oriented tables where a column shows the output, or that shows the iron industry. To produce 10 units of output, it says I'll use 0.1 unit of iron, 2 units of coal, 0.3 units of labor, etc. And for every industry in the economy, ideally you have a column like that, and the rows tell you how much is used up. But that's not enough if you're doing realistic planning. That is the way the IO tables are typically published, but you have to go beyond that if you're going to do some planning. You need to know what the capital stock that was used to produce these outputs are. So ideally, I mean, again, I'm using a highly artificial economy. It's based on sort of Sraffa's type of model, that you've got a table here with the same format, which says to produce the 10 units of iron, I needed a fixed capital stock of 10 units of iron. And for the coal industry, there was a fixed capital stock of 10 units of iron. Okay? And these different types of capital goods have different depreciation rates. So there's another table which specifies the depreciation rate, which I show as being, say, a 14-year depreciation rate for iron, which is typical of production machinery. For things which are consumed during the process of the production very quickly, I'm saying the production rate, the depreciation rate is 0.5, so it's much faster. But you can set this to whatever levels you want in the tables. And then the final table gives you the targets. How many units of iron, how much of coal, how much corn, bread, labor, etc. So everything is in spreadsheet format, and everything is in a readable format to work with. The software then translates your plan, which had specified the technologies, existing capital stocks, etc., and the targets say how much labor you want employed each year. Okay, so in this case, I'm showing the labor supply gradually going up. The software then translates this into linear programming format. So let's take an example of this. What we're saying is we're going to maximize plan target fulfillment for each year. Okay, the sum of plan target fulfillment over all those years. And we have what you can either call a Kantorovich plan ray or Leontief demand function, which says, okay, the plan fulfillment for year one must at least meet a certain level of final consumption of iron given in the targets. It must at least meet a level of production of coal, etc. And there are then resource constraints have to be put in for the linear program. You have to say, for example, the labor available for year one has got to be greater than equal to the labor used in every industry. And you can set an external constraint that the labor available for year one is less than or equal to 3, which we got from the tables. And the other constraints are set by the capital stock and the flows in the table. So you get a vast number of equations, which are the constraints implied by the input-output table structure. And you then link the years together by means of the capital stocks from one year to the next. So basically, the important thing here is to say, for each type of capital stock for every year, it says the capital stock made up of coal in year 2 is going to be set by the capital stock made up of coal in year 1, less the depreciation in coal of production of year 1, and plus the accumulation of whatever that good is. Okay, now the names coal, iron, etc. I'm just doing for example. If you had a real IO table, these would be the names of the actual industries in the IO table, though you'd probably have to make sure that there were no spaces in the names. But it's clear that if you're going to do this kind of thing, the mathematical problem must be tractable. If you have 100 industries, this method may work, but if you increase to a million, it might be prohibitively slow. And all of this is being done using the open source linear programming package LPsolve, which is the same underlying engine as you would have in a spreadsheet using LibreOffice, for example. It's an open source package which you can easily install. And the plan program generates the LPsolve program, which you then feed into LPsolve to solve it. The problem with this is that it's polynomial time. Here's a graph showing the number of sectors in the economy. And this is the time in seconds that it takes to compute the plan. This was done on a 50-pound computer, just to show what you could do with a very small computer, a 50-pound Odroid computer. And as you scale up here, you see it's a constant slope on a log-log graph. Therefore, it's a polynomial function. And if you look at the slope of the polynomial function, you see it's roughly a polynomial of order 3, which is fine. Here, we can go up for a 5-year plan for roughly 100 sectors, which is typical of most published IO tables. You can do it in a few hundred seconds. Not a serious problem. And as I say, this is on a 50-pound computer, which uses the same kind of chip as you've got in your mobile phone. So this is fine for strategic national economic planning, using the level of detail that's already available in currently published economic statistics. If you are wanting to apply this stuff in Brazil, your main problem would be to get good estimates of the capital stocks in the different industries, because not all countries publish good broken down data on the capital stocks in different industries. And you would also need to get information on the actual depreciation rates of different types of capital in different industries. But it's far too slow for large plans. So for 500 industries, fitting that complexity order takes 17 hours for a 5-year plan, 2.2 years for a 5,000 industry, for 50,000 industries, 2,000 years. Obviously, this is impossible. And this is the kind of reasoning that you get Alec Nove saying that detailed planning at the Soviet scale is impossible. That's because of the type of algorithm they're using. We were aware of that when we wrote Towards a New Socialism. And we developed a near linear algorithm before the book came out. I originally developed that in 1989, but I've long since lost the source code we use for the experiments. So there's a new version of this written in Java on GitHub, and you can look at the GitHub address for it there. How do we know that the log linear solution must exist? Given that any explicit calculation or algorithm that humans can do can also in principle be done by computers. Given also that the complexity order of an algorithm doesn't change depending on whether people do it by hand or a computer does it, it follows that the existence of a functioning market economy is proof that low complexity order applies to economic coordination algorithms. If it were not the case, the ability of large economies involving millions of people to coordinate themselves by the market would be impossible. They clearly can't have algorithms of the order of n to the third, or they'd never be able to produce the hundreds of millions of products that Amazon actually has on sale. So the actual complexity orders of the calculations that are being done in a market economy must be much lower. And the harmony algorithm was designed to mimic these kinds of calculations. It was designed to be n log n, and I'd previously shown it to be n log n on single year plans. Basic idea is you've got this harmony function which is taken from neural nets, and it's designed to mimic the principle of positive but diminishing marginal social utility. You want a function whose value rises as plan fulfillment approaches, but which rewards over fulfillment less than it punishes under fulfillment. So here's the type of shape you want. If that is the planned target, two units of output, and if you're producing less than 2 units of output, you go into negative territory here. It's 0 exactly when you're on planned target. When you're above planned target, it's positive, but the slope is lower, so that you are rewarding that less. The actual function I use in the code I've released is this. Basically, for the positive part, it's a log function. For the negative part, it's a second order polynomial. And S is the level of surplus being produced relative to the target. Now, the advantage of it is, firstly, that it's more flexible with respect to planned targets, in that it rewards over fulfillment, yet it punishes shortfalls. And because the function has a continuous first derivative, it allows it's a continuous first derivative except at point 0, which is a bit of a problem with it. You can use other functions for that are continuous. Because it has over most places, it's got a derivative. You can use Newton's method of approximation. So let's look at Newton's method. This is the harmony function. This is the output. There's your planned target. And we know it'll pass through 0 at the planned target. So we've drawn the harmony function there, passing through 0. Suppose we've got two industries, A, which is over-fulfilling, and B, which is under-fulfilling. In order to meet, our target is that they all should have the same degree of harmony. So we want to reduce A and increase B, and the resources of labor and means of production released by reducing the output of A will go towards increasing output of B. And since you've got the gradients, you can use Newton's method to find the intersection with the mean. But since these overshoot, you reduce by a little less than that, say reduce by half. And if you do this, at the second stage, you've brought these two things closer together and you've got a new mean, but it tends to be below the original mean you had before. So it converges on the mean but shifts down. So you need a separate stage which slides the mean up along the harmony function. And what I've done is I use the marginal harmony gain as a dummy rate of profit. So we shift resources to the industry where the marginal harmony gain is highest. Essentially, we're using the derivative of the harmony function of each product as a shadow price and computing a rate of return for each technique on that. It can lead to instabilities if industries have negative harmony gain. So there are ways, I borrow another technique from neural nets, which basically says I clamp the possible values into a sigmoid function, and that stabilizes it. If you download the software, there's detailed accounts of the maths used. Let's look at some results, though. This is the time that you get, the time curve you get using LP solve. This is the time curve you get using the harmony function. And you see that the harmony function has much more tractable results. Okay, if we take the log of the slope, it's close to 1. So it's a much better, close to linear complexity function. I've also released a Pascal version as well as a Java function. This is on a slightly faster computer, still a very cheap computer. However, if we scale it up, we find that the Java one does better on large problems. If I give this time in seconds here, I haven't run it for these large problems, but just taking the complexity order and projecting forward, it implies that you could do the 10 million product economy in roughly 2 hours on a very cheap PC. The problem with a very cheap PC is it doesn't have enough memory, so you need to have a much more expensive PC to do it. This obviously, I have been able to use 2 CPU cores to do a 5-year plan in under 10 minutes, which LP solve would have taken 2,400 years. The big problem is that what slows everything down is reading the data in, because I've done everything in terms of spreadsheets, and most of the spreadsheets are zeros once you get to a highly disaggregated table. So you're reading in lots of zeros, and you spend most of the time reading the stuff from files. If you were actually going to use this in anger, this kind of algorithm, you'd obviously keep data in relational database form, not as spreadsheets. You'd also parallelize the algorithm if you're going to handle millions of products. But if you're going to do a production quality system for detailed national plans, it's not something that can be done by an academic amateur in their spare time. You would have to hire a proper software team to complete all parts of the package, and you'd need serious computing resources. There's the GitHub package that you've got to go to. The next way is to look at combining Leontief style planning with harmony planning. Now, the advantage of Leontief style planning is that it works directly from the IO tables, and you only need the harmony stuff for doing the multi-year aspect of it. So this is you can get this from SourceForge. And I give a detailed theoretical account of the maths in a PDF file, and I give 2 example programs. Leontief, another initially Russian mathematician, started out in the Soviet Union, later emigrated to America. And he allowed planning to be treated as a branch of matrix analysis. And he subsequently had a big impact on Marxist economics. For instance, the work of Morishima is heavily based on Leontief. Now, in the example I've released for the Julia system, I actually take not a toy IO table, I take the most compact version of the European Union's IO table for 2006, and I've broken it. I've taken one which has only got 4 or 5 sectors, because that's the most I can show on the screen for lectures. Okay, and these are actual data from the European Union. So it's highly aggregated for demonstration purposes, and I regularized the structure to be in a more Marxian form. So again, that's the output of agriculture used in agriculture, and the figures are in millions of euros. They're not in physical terms. Leontief gives since he's dealing with industry aggregates, he gives the stuff in units of money, The only country I know of that publishes physical I/O tables or has published physical I/O tables recently is Germany. So anyone, there's some complexity in how you deal with foreign trade, which I discuss in the documentation of the paper. So that's exports of industrial products. So with Leontief and Morishima and all Marxian economics following Morishima, everything is done in terms of the A matrix, which is basically the matrix which tells you how much of each input you need to produce 1 unit of output. So each cell Aij says what fraction of a euro's worth of input I was used to make €1 worth of output J. That is the sort of Leontief Morishima format. So you don't have an output row, it's implicit. Suppose we specify the gross output as a column vector O. Then you can simply compute the vector of intermediate products required to meet this by a simple matrix multiplication. You multiply the gross output vector by the A matrix, and you get the vector of resources that you're going to need to do that. This is just demonstrating that if I take the European A matrix, I set the actual gross output for 2006 as a column vector. I multiply them together, I get the matrix of intermediate products that were actually used in Europe that year. You can also work out how much is going to be available for final consumption, obviously by subtracting A.O from the gross output, and that'll leave you F, the net output. This is all Leontief's maths. Now, if we try that in Julia, we get an error. Why do we get an error? What's wrong? It's because our A matrix has 6 rows and 5 columns, and it's not a square matrix. We have a labor input row, but we've got no labor output row, because in the capitalist economy, it's not slavery and there's no industry producing labor power. What we can do is just put a column vector of zeros in there, because there's no industry producing labor power, but logically we need a labor power sector. So we're saying we want 0 gross production of labor power, and this industry is all zeros. After that, it works. And it gives us a negative final consumption of labor power, which is the actual employment. I can type in that formula and get this answer. So this is the nice thing about Julia, is both that it's an extremely high performance language. It compiles stuff and runs it very fast, but it's also interactive. So it's very good for working with this kind of economic data. I remove the negative labor value and compare it with what the true output is, and we get that. Sorry, I'm using a new formula here. I'm dividing through by I minus A. I'm dividing that into F to get the gross output. It's all standard Marxian Leontief economics from the 50s. Next problem is, how do you link up a sequence of years to form a 5-year plan? I did say Julia, like Octave or Euler, makes it very easy to do these calculations. Now, this is a basic Leontief relationship. We have output is equal to AO plus F. This is the net use of resources plus the final product. And it therefore means that to achieve a given final product of F, we have to have an output of O minus AO. If we take O as a common factor, we can express it as that. But we can then calculate what output, gross output, would be required to meet a given F. So final product, we can require the gross output required for any given pattern of consumption. And here I've done it by using a matrix inversion, because this is an inverse term going into the equation. So this is the matrix format we've used so far. When you move into time, you have to move from a matrix format to a tensor format. So you've got an IO table here, or an A matrix here, but you have to have an A tensor for the time extended version of it. And previously had an output vector, and you have an output matrix that extends backwards into the time axis. So in addition, you have a capital stock tensor and an investment tensor. And the capital stock tensor is going to be the integral of the investment tensor convolved with the depreciation function. That's to say, the stock in year n is a sum of investment in years 1 to n weighted by depreciation. And you can choose to either use a linear depreciation function or a negative exponential depreciation function. One way or the other, you can use either. If a society invests in means of production this year, it increases its future consumption potential at the expense of this year's consumption. The issue is, how do you balance these? The solution I used when dealing with the Kantorovich planning was just to maximize total consumption over n years. But what you find if you look in detail at the plans you get, is that they tend to impose a big cut in consumption in year 1 in order to get the investment to raise it in future years. This is notoriously what happened in early Soviet planning. This is Real Wages from Allen's book in the Soviet Union. This other curve is one that I computed from, this is Allen's Real Wages, the black curve. The dotted one is my estimate of child nutrition in the Soviet Union done by convolving adult heights with the child growth rate. And you see they fit very well. But the important thing is, in both cases, it shows a sharp decline in consumption for about 3 or 4 years in order to achieve a rapid growth. Of course, once the war starts, everything falls again. But that's too extreme. And again, the harmony function comes in as a way of dealing with this. In this case, I've used a different harmony function, but it's got the same general shape. Because my friend Alan pointed out that my previous harmony function didn't have a continuous first derivative. So we try to maximize the sum of harmonies of all years. So how do you calculate the harmony for 1 year as opposed to the product in a year? You can either take the mean of the harmonies of all industries, or you take the lowest harmony of all industries. I find that taking the lowest harmony for that year is the better approach. The next thing you have when doing planning is, you say you're going to do a 5-year plan. So how are you optimizing on future years? If you're not careful and you put this into an algorithm, the algorithm will compute that the best thing to do is to use up all your stocks as fast as possible in the last 3 years, because it doesn't think it's going to need any capital stocks the year after that. So it allocates nothing for investment in the last 2 or 3 years. what you have to do is actually set your plan. If you want a 5-year plan, you have to make it 5 plus n years, where the n is your depreciation horizon. So you plan for the future beyond the 5 years that you're actually planning in detail, to prevent the thing running down capital stocks at the end of the period. Again, this is a similar sort of thing, Newtonian conversion algorithm, and it iterates until we get the either a maximum number of attempts or the coefficient of variation of harmony falls below a threshold. That's to say, you've moved the harmony over the years as close as possible. Again, driven by the same kind of data as before, an IO table, an IO flow table, capital stock table, depreciation rate, and the labor and targets file. Again, same sort of format. That's the labor available in year 2. That's final consumption of agriculture in year 4. And next come to the performance issues. Leontief defines it in terms of performing a matrix inversion. But in practice, the problem with matrix inversion is equivalent to matrix multiplication. And again, that's got a complexity order of n to the 3rd, and you don't want to do that. In practice, you can deal with this using a linear solver. And the language Julia has got a very efficient matrix multiply system, an efficient, a good quality matrix inverse, but it's got an even better quality linear solver. So instead of writing it like that, if you write it like that, it invokes the linear solver, and the linear solver runs very much faster. The great majority of the elements of a huge input-output table will be 0. This allows the matrix to be stored in sparse form. Again, a nice feature of the Julia programming language is it has good support for sparse matrices. And you can do matrix algebra using sparse matrices in a way which it's completely transparent to you whether the matrix is sparse or non-sparse. You use the same formula. Now, what do we know about the sparseness of actual economies? Well, this is work done by one of my PhD students on the US economy, taking the most disaggregated version of the US IO table and successively aggregating it down from 440 or so industries right down to just a handful of industries. And if you then move upwards, the vertical scale is a number of new non-zeros in the table that occur as you expand the number of industries. And these grow proportional to the number of sectors initially, but then it levels off and becomes almost a constant. Now, this is something important. In order to get performance measures, I work by simulating a much larger economy. I take the European economy and I get successively hypothetical disaggregated versions of the European economy. Disaggregated in such a way that if you re-aggregated them, they would be the same economy. But you introduce occasional zeros in the table. So if we take this cell here, it expands out to 4 cells, there are a couple of zeros, and these 2 are actual halves of this number. So if you re-aggregate it, you get the same thing. Now, we know that if you re-aggregate, you get to the same thing, but we get successively more zeros as we successively disaggregate. So if we take pictures of the IO table, and we have a blank pixel wherever you have a non-zero value, you see that as you get it bigger and bigger and bigger, the more and more zeros, which are shown as white. And the Julia system, I have taken it up to a matrix by 7,000 on an edge, okay? 7,000 on an edge, well, that's 35 million, is it? Yeah, 35 million elements in the fully populated matrix, but far less in the sparse matrix. This is the number of cells in the matrix, and this is the time to run it. And a matrix 7,000 square on the edge, I'm able to solve the problem in less than a second. Again, very much faster than we were doing before. And the time to solve is roughly linear with the non-zeros in the matrix. So I've assumed n log n growth in non-zeros in past papers. I did that because this comes from a theorem of Erdős, that in a random graph, if you have n log n average fan out, you'll get a fully connected graph. The other possibility is that the economy is what's known as a small world graph. And these are common in social networks, airline networks, and things like that. In which case, the number of non-zeros grows even slower. It grows sort of like kn, which is the best scenario. Now, if we look at this graph, it appears that this has got this is the US economy. It appears to have small world properties, which is the best possible scenario for socialist planning. It's worth having a look at the work of this guy, Hardin. He has gone beyond the scale that I'm dealing with. He's got models of up to 10 to the 8 non-zeros in the A matrix. And he finds he is using full linear programming, using more modern linear programming techniques than LP-solve uses. So his is the soundest stuff. And he's able to solve full linear programming of that size in under 10 to the 4 seconds, which is, say, under 3 hours on an 8 gigabyte machine. If we had a K of 150, this corresponds to economies with the order of 1 million products. And if he ran it, if instead of doing it in a little cheap laptop, he was using a decent multi-core machine, he could easily scale it up to the level of the full Soviet economy. And what's important about this is he's actually using Kantorowicz's style linear programming, except using much more modern linear programming algorithms than Kantorowicz. I think this is the end of my talk. I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you very much, Professor Paul Cockshott. We have some questions to you. The first of one is from Caio Fernandes. How do you see the possibilities and potentials to use this kind of new computational tools for supporting new and more efficient industrial policies, especially on underdeveloped countries?
Manual planning techniques. The Soviets were able to achieve very rapid rates of growth. And that's easily doable in times of or in circumstances where you have a relatively underdeveloped economy and you still have considerable reserves of labor power. And the question then is, how do you accelerate the accumulation of capital stock in the right sectors in order to meet these needs? The level which you can apply these algorithms is initially at the level of the IO tables. If you had a socialist government elected in Brazil, you could apply this kind of planning to, say, the 100 industry sector level almost immediately from the data you've got available from the IO tables. But it does demand that the state is able to direct investment. You can't do this or expect to be able to do this kind of planning if you're relying on market incentives. the state has to be at least able to exercise the degree of control of aggregate investment that the Chinese government is able to exercise. So an initial level would be at the sort of IO table level disaggregation. Sorry, the 100 sector disaggregation, which the IO tables have.
Great. The next question, I will speak so slowly, is from Fabrizio Pitombo Leite. Considering that Brazilian official released data does not include capital stock estimates, do you think World Input-Output database could do the trick?
I don't know enough of the World Input-Output database to know whether that's the case. I would have thought that the World Input-Output database is probably based on data already published by national statistical agencies. There is work published by some Chinese economists in the World Review of Political Economy, where they construct detailed capital stock tables for China using only published data and doing various types of inference to work out what the likely infills are for the parts they don't have details on. But the more you do of that, the less accurate your plan is going to be. I mean, to do well, you need the National Statistical Agency to try and collect good data on capital stock. I mean, in principle, just company accounts isn't enough. You need to know what format the capital stock was in. I mean, the British embassy in East Berlin in early 50s, late 40s is reported to have said that the East Germans had such detailed capital stocks that they knew where every machine tool was. I mean, that's ideally the level you needed.
Great, thank you. The next question is from Rodrigo Santaella. Rodrigo asks, in your work, Professor Paul Cockshott, you have always discussed the attempts at economic planning in the USSR, demonstrating its technical and political limits and pointing that it would have been possible to advance further in a socialist planned economy with the technology available since the 70s, and also showing that today it's possible to plan on a large scale with the level of technology available. I would like you to comment on other socialist experiences that try economic planning in 20th century, like China, Chile, and Cuba. More specifically on how technology was used to make them work.
Problem with that is I really don't have enough information about what is done in Cuba or what is currently done in China. The stuff from Chile has been published, and Stafford Beer reports on it in his book. The problem with that is that it was cybernetics in the sense of military command and control. Well, of course, the whole field of cybernetics arose out of military command and control. And that is not quite the same as economic planning. It's good for crisis management, but it's not actually the same as long-term planning. It was very good for dealing with acting quickly and dealing with ongoing crisis. And if you look at the systems that Beer designed, they were all based around the techniques that were developed for air defense systems. the projection of information in real time, the groups of commanders making decisions, pressing buttons to come up with the decisions. Well, the pressing buttons was new, but it was all based on experience of military techniques. And I'm not convinced that that is adequate for long-term planning.
Thanks. The next question is from Rafael de Preste. What are the main problems in planning with I/O tables expressed in monetary terms? How to estimate capital in physical quantities?
That's a very real issue, because the most immediate requirement for planning at the moment is to meet ecological concerns. And the monetary I/O tables that the governments publish don't actually give you the kind of physical details that you require to know about how much carbon dioxide is being used up in a given process, for example. So although the monetary data gives you magnitudes of interaction, they're not broken down into physically meaningful units. As I say, the German I/O tables were published in triplicate form. They published them in, I don't know if they still do this, but when Carsten Stamher was in charge, they used to publish them in money form, physical unit terms, and time terms, amount of labor hours. That would have been much better. But I think if you are wanting to do it now, there is clearly got to be a great deal of effort put into preparing realistic estimates of how much is physically being used in a given industry. Now, you can do this, for instance, if you take the energy industries and you can look at flows of oil into the electricity industry. It's not too difficult to go from the monetary flows of oil into millions of tons of oil equivalent. And if you, certainly for Britain, if you look at the statistics published by the Department of Energy, in addition to the statistics published by the Treasury or the National Economic Statistics, you can start to get a handle on that. But it requires teamwork of quite a lot of people working together to do it.
Thank you very much. The next question is mine. Professor, other economists in the few years have taken up the issue of socialist economic planning in relation to role of the algorithms, such as Michael Rosowski in the book The People's Republic of Walmart, and Aaron Benanav, our next speaker here, in the book Automation and the Future of Work, speaking about the role of algorithms in socialist economic planning. How does your work dialogue or related with their work?
I'm afraid I know of Lee Phillips' work in the People's Republic of Walmart. I don't know of the other work. I don't think there's any contradiction between what Alan Cottrell and I have written and what Lee Phillips has written, but I don't know about the second author you mentioned, the other.
Great. The other author is Aaron Benanav. His book is very good too.
Could you type it into the screen? So,
okay.
As a message.
Okay. The next question is from Fabrício Pitombo Leite. Apart from computational limitations, what do you think about an angle type structural change of consumption patterns, as in Pasinet, for planning simulation purpose?
I'm afraid I don't understand the question.
Yeah. Okay. The people have one more question. Esther, do you have questions? Esther? Do you have
I
questions?
would have a question regarding the more general discussion you have on modes of production or what it means, of production. If you could talk a little bit more when you highlight or you focus on the role of the productive forces and not relations of production.
Okay.
You talk a lot that electricity or sync energy or that finally computation would be the basis for other modes of production.
Well, I think if you go and look in Capital by what to see where Marx uses the term mode of production, I suggest you get a copy of a PDF file of Capital and find all occurrences of the phrase mode of production. You will find that the great majority, he is talking about the mode of material production. He's not talking about relations of production. The idea that a mode of production is a combination of relations and forces of production comes from Stalin's book, Dialectical and Historical Materialism. And after that came out in the 1930s, that became the standard interpretation in the Soviet Union, and from there it became the standard interpretation of what Marx meant by that in the West. But I don't think that's what Marx actually means. He talks about transformations of the mode of production within capitalist relations of production. So he talks of that capitalist relations of production first take hold of production and impose a formal subordination of labor to capital, where people are formally dependent on wage labor. But that formal dependence is only brought about by the fact that they happen, through historical circumstances of being driven off the land, to be forced to sell their labor power. In principle, the form of physical production which existed was such that they could still, with a change in ownership, have still carried out individual production. And the mode of production doesn't change until the physical form of the means of production are changed into machine industry. And once that physical form of production is changed, then you have the real subordination of labor, because it becomes impossible for the individual worker to own and control the actual material means of production. And that's what he means by the mode of production. So I'm just trying to emphasize that in Capital and in Marx's writing, there is a very strong emphasis on technology and the technical character of the form of production that takes place. And that should always be at the center of one's analysis of an economy in a country. What is the physical type of production? And what limits does that physical type of production put on the production relations that are possible? Because there's more than one set of production relations may be possible given a certain mode of production, a certain mode of material production.
Great. We have two more questions from Rodrigo Santaella. What is essential in terms of understanding computer programming and mathematics so that academical and political left can incorporate the proposals of a contemporary socialist planned economy?
The nature of the workforce changes over time. So an increasing number of people know how to use these technologies. I don't think there is any shortage of people who know how these technologies work. And if the socialist movement is able to offer a convincing picture of the future, to technically trained young workers in the technology industries, you won't be short of people who have the skills.
Okay. Rodrigo continues his question. On the other hand, what level of technical knowledge is necessary to make possible a direct and conscious democratic participation of the population as a whole in planning decisions?
Well, that I think has to come down to being able to present things in a manner that is comprehensible to people as a whole in terms of their own lives. And you can't expect people to be concerned with the fine details of national planning, but that you can get them to be concerned with things at an aggregate level, like if we were operating a time economy, how much of my time each week am I willing to work for changing the structure of the economy to meet global warming constraints? How many hours a week am I willing to work to support health services? So if you can turn the questions into questions that are understandable to people, then I don't think the population needs any extra level of knowledge other than the level of general experience. This is the Aristotle's point about humans being a zoopolitikon. We're a political animal. If things are expressed in terms that people can understand, anyone is able to make a judgment. Thing on the changing consumption basket. Well, there's no problem with that formally, in that the example software I've got allows you to change the consumption basket, to project a consumption basket change year on year, because it doesn't say we want a single consumption basket every year. It allows you to specify it separately for each individual year. So that's not a problem.
Great. Okay, this was the second presentation from Automation and Digitalization in Contemporary Capitalism. The seminar is jointly organized by 3 research groups here in Brazil. The research group in the Political Economy of Development from the Federal University of Rio Grande do Norte, the research group in Economy, Society and Technology, NETS, from Federal University of Ceará, and DigiLabor Research Lab from Unisinos University. We thank you very much, Paul Cockshott, and we wait you for our next keynote speakers. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.